Okay, let's unpack this. We've got a truly dense, sprawling text here, excerpts from a classic of Russian literature.
Mm-hmm.
Think of this as a deep dive into the heart of a famously complex family and the wild, profound ideas they grapple with.
Yeah, these sources, they really give us snapshots, don't they? Windows into this world.
They do.
They introduce us to the characters, the swirling conflicts, and these incredibly deep philosophical and spiritual questions that are just woven through everything.
And our mission in this deep dive,
Yeah.
to pull out the most important threads, connect the dots across these different realms, the spiritual, the worldly, the intellectual,
Right.
and help you navigate this fascinating world, even if you haven't read the whole thing cover to cover.
Which, let's be honest, is a big undertaking.
It really is. So here's where it gets really interesting. We're going to explore the central figures and the powerful, often destructive forces that drive them.
Things like passionate love, desperate financial straits.
Absolutely. And those profound questions of faith, justice, and suffering.
And at the center of it all is the Karamazov family, particularly the patriarch, Fyodor Pavlovitch.
Ah, Fyodor.
The sources paint a pretty vivid and, frankly, unpleasant picture of his history. He seems driven by self-interest from the start, you know? Eager to make a career, land a dowry. He marries Adelaide Ivanovna.
The mother of Alyosha and Dmitri.
Exactly. And despite her beauty, there doesn't seem to have been much affection. He was known for being quite, well, voluptuous and chasing women.
And he really took advantage of that first marriage financially, didn't he?
Oh, completely. The sources explicitly state he got hold of all her money, 25,000 rubles, basically as soon as she received it.
Wow. And she never saw it again.
Never saw it again. He even tried to claim her dowry property.
Oh.
And when she ran off and eventually died, well, he essentially abandoned her sons, Dmitri and Alyosha.
Just left them.
Pretty much. And he repeated a similar pattern with his second wife, Sofia Ivanovna, Ivan's mother, who also died young, in Petersburg.
So the sons were just farmed out, left to be raised by others.
That's right. Though there's one notable exception to the money grabbing.
Oh.
2,000 rubles left specifically for Ivan and Alyosha by a general's widow. A man named Yefim Petrovich, he kept that money safe. Actually doubled it with interest by the time the boys came of age.
That's something, at least.
It is, and the sources mention Alyosha, the youngest, was particularly fond of him. You can see why.
So you have this deeply cynical, self-serving father embodying this kind of earthly chaos.
Right.
And then these three sons who represent very different paths, different reactions to it.
Exactly. Dmitri, the eldest, all passion, volatility, earthly desires. Ivan, the intellectual, really struggling with these deep questions of meaning.
Yeah.
And Alexei, or Alyosha, the youngest, who's drawn towards something, well, spiritual.
Which leads us naturally from the Karamazov family's worldly mess to a contrasting realm presented in the sources.
The spiritual world, embodied by the local monastery and this concept of the elders.
This is where we meet Father Zossima. He's a deeply respected elder living in a hermitage.
Right, sort of set apart.
And he's seriously ill, nearing death when we encounter him, and there's this immense anticipation surrounding him.
People are expecting miracles.
Right.
Even from his relics after he's gone.
Exactly. The sources even mention Alyosha's unquestioning faith in this sort of thing, like a story about a coffin flying out of a church. It really highlights the atmosphere.
Yeah, that fervent belief around the elder. And Father Zossima, he interacts with various visitors. There's a landowner, Maximov, and a lady seeking healing for her daughter, Lise.
And his response there is significant, isn't it?
Very. He emphasizes that any healing comes solely from God's will. It's not about the elder's power. Humility. But what's truly foundational to understanding Zossima is his own story. He shares these experiences from his younger life, an attachment to a noble girl, a duel.
A duel.
Yeah, which led him to this profound, almost radical realization. Each responsible to all for all.
That phrase again.
That moment changed everything for him. It led him to quit the army, become a monk.
That idea, each responsible to all for all, it feels like the absolute core of his teaching, doesn't it?
It absolutely is. He even recalls his brother Markel expressing something very similar on his deathbed.
Wow.
It's not just a nice phrase for him. It's the lens through which he sees the world. His teachings revolve around this universal responsibility.
Okay.
Along with the power of forgiveness, active love, and this really challenging idea. Seeking suffering for oneself when others do wrong.
Seeking suffering. That's intense.
It is. He sees prayer as a kind of education, speaks of a connection to other worlds, and he held this very specific, powerful view on the church's role.
Which was?
That it should ultimately transform the state rather than just, fit within its structures.
That's a big vision, but then something happens after his death that challenges all the anticipation, all that faith.
Right. The sources describe this immense excitement among the monks, the visitors. They're expecting a marvel, maybe his body being preserved, like some saints.
Incorruptibility.
Exactly. Instead, almost immediately, signs of decomposition appear. Quite vividly described, actually.
Oh, so the opposite of a miracle.
Pretty much. And this leads to a real crisis for some profound disappointment, shock. It stands in stark contrast to the hopes people had, hopes maybe fueled by stories of other revered figures, like the ascetic monk Job mentioned in the text.
It forces a reckoning with their faith and expectations.
Definitely.
And right alongside Father Zossima, the sources introduce this counterpoint figure, Father Farapon.
Farapon. Yeah, he represents a completely different path.
How so?
Well, he sees the whole concept of eldership as dangerous. A pernicious innovation, he calls it.
Wow, strong words.
He's incredibly ascetic, lives in almost total isolation. Seems almost crazy to some observers.
Yeah.
Yet he attracts certain visitors who are drawn to that extreme path.
So a different kind of holiness or perceived holiness?
Perhaps. He rarely appears but speaks of visions, even fearing Christ will snatch him up.
Huh.
We were shown that there's this monk from Obdorsk who clearly favors Farapon's way over Zossima's.
So even within the monastery walls, there are these fundamentally different understandings of the spiritual life.
Exactly. You have Zossima embodying this path of active love, forgiveness, connection to humanity. Contrasted with Farapon, representing extreme asceticism, isolation, intense personal visions. They present you, the listener, with very different ideas about faith.
Okay, so shifting dramatically from the monastery's spiritual, sometimes conflicting world,
Right.
we dive headfirst into the chaotic, grasping, worldly realm, dominated by money, passion, conflict, especially centered around Dmitri.
Dmitri. Yeah, his life seems defined by two key things, really. His inheritance dispute with his father, Fyodor Pavlovitch.
Always about the money with Fyodor.
Pretty much. And this significant debt Dmitri owes, 3,000 rubles to Katerina Ivanovna.
Right, and that entanglement, financial and romantic, is really what drives so much of his frantic behavior.
Absolutely, it's the engine.
And at the heart of his romantic drama, there's Grushenka.
Grushenka. The sources describe her in these fascinating, contradictory ways. She seems very aware of her own power. Says she wins hearts in my nasty spite.
Self-aware, maybe?
Possibly. She definitely has a love of money, lends it out at high interest, even calls herself a merciless cheat and swindler.
Doesn't pull any punches about herself.
Not really. She's involved with an old merchant who's paralyzed but apparently leaving her money. Her nature is described as incredibly volatile, swinging between moods.
Unpredictable.
Very. And she lives with this fear and anticipation of the return of an officer who seduced her years ago. It hints at this deep past wound.
Adds complexity.
It does. And there's that poignant little story she tells, the onion story.
Yeah, I remember that.
Which Alyosha interprets as meaning even a single good deed, like giving an onion, could be enough to save a soul. It adds this layer of potential redemption, or at least depth, to a character who also seems capable of real manipulation.
And there's the other woman in Dmitri's life, Katerina Ivanovna.
Right. Portrayed with pride and haughtiness. Initially, she showed contempt for Dmitri.
Yet she's the one he owes the 3,000 rubles to, money she gave him, but framed it as being sent to her sister.
Exactly. It seems like this complex act may be to save his honor, maybe out of her own conflicted feelings. It's murky.
And she's betrothed to Dmitri, but seems to have feelings for Ivan.
Deep, perhaps unacknowledged feelings, yes. And the sources say she torments Ivan. It's all very tangled.
So Dmitri's caught between this debt, his father's money he thinks he's owed, and these two incredibly intense women.
Which makes him increasingly desperate for funds. He tries everything. He goes to this man, Samsonov, about selling land rights in Chermashnya.
Right.
But he's so frantic he gets confused about the details, the people involved, Lyagavi, Gorskin. It's a mess.
He's spinning out.
Totally. He also goes to Madame Holikov, a wealthy woman, asking for the 3,000.
And she just talks about gold mines.
Yeah. Completely disconnected from his reality, starts rambling about investing in gold mines instead of just giving him the loan. It just highlights how lost and misunderstood he is.
So his desperate plan is basically to get that 3,000 rubles.
The exact amount he owes Katerina.
So he can be free of her and presumably run off with Grushenka.
That seems to be the idea. This intense blend of financial pressure and romantic obsession, well, it sets the stage for disaster.
Okay. So moving from these intense worldly conflicts, we turn to the intellectual realm, primarily Ivan Karamazov and, chillingly, Smerdyakov.
Ivan, he's the intellectual brother, proud, often avoids sentimentality, but he is tormented, absolutely tormented, by a fundamental struggle with faith.
He questions everything.
He really does. The very foundation of morality without God. He wonders if figures like Rakitin are right, if God is just an idea made up by men.
And his conversation with Alyosha about the suffering of children, that's maybe the most stark expression of this struggle.
It's devastating. He cannot, will not accept any higher harmony, any future paradise, if it requires the suffering of even one innocent, tortured child.
He rejects it completely.
Completely. He rejects pitying figures from theological stories who supposedly stole freedom from heaven. He prefers his own logic, his Euclidean understanding, even though it offers him no comfort, only pain.
Which leads him to create, or imagine, the Grand Inquisitor.
Right, one of the most famous parts of the sources. This imagined story where Christ returns during the Spanish Inquisition.
And gets arrested by the Grand Inquisitor.
Exactly. And the aged Inquisitor argues that Christ tormented humanity by giving them freedom, this burden they can't bear.
So the church fixed it.
That's the claim. The Inquisitor says the church corrected Christ's work, took Caesar's sword, offered earthly bread in exchange for that painful freedom.
Promising peace and happiness after ages of human confusion and suffering.
And even says they will permit people to sin because they're weak.
Wow. It's an incredibly powerful thought experiment, isn't it? About freedom versus security, belief versus control.
Absolutely. Even questioning if humanity wants the truth if it comes with suffering.
Deep stuff. And intertwined with Ivan's intellectual turmoil is Smerdyakov.
Smerdyakov, Fyodor Pavlovitch's servant. The sources describe him with really unsettling detail. Pale, trembling, resentful, insolent.
And he has epilepsy, but he can also fake it.
Crucially, yes. He has the ability to feign fits, which becomes a key plot point later. His relationship with both Fyodor and Ivan is charged with this strange mix of contempt and maybe a dark kind of understanding.
Ivan starts to suspect him, right? Develops this loathing.
A growing suspicion and loathing, yes. Especially after a particularly charged conversation they have just before Ivan leaves for Chermashnev.
Feels like foreshadowing.
Definitely. And this tension just explodes after the murder when Smerdyakov confesses to Ivan.
He confesses. Just like that.
Well, not just like that. He claims Ivan knew he intended to kill Fyodor Pavlovitch. He interpreted Ivan's decision to leave town as implicit consent. As if Ivan was signaling that, for people like them, everything is lawful.
Wow. That's a heavy accusation.
Yeah, it is. Smerdyakov admits to faking his epileptic fit on the night of the murder as an alibi, planning to fall down the cellar stairs.
Clever. In a horrible way.
But the most chilling part is his assertion that Ivan was the real murderer.
He says Ivan did it.
No, he says he did it, but that he was merely Ivan's instrument. That Ivan's ideas, Ivan's departure, made it possible, made it lawful in his mind. Then he confesses to the actual murder and taking the money.
That is incredibly dark, and it leads us directly to the crime itself and the investigation.
Exactly. The sources give us details of the night of the murder, particularly from Dmitri's perspective.
What was he doing?
He was outside, waiting in the garden, desperate to get to Grushenka. He jumps the fence, knocks down the old servant Grigory with a pestle he grabbed.
He hit Grigory. Badly.
Yes, quite badly. Then he goes into the house looking for Grushenka, finds only the servant Fenya, realizes Grushenka isn't there, and leaves in despair.
So he was there, he assaulted Grigory, but didn't kill his father.
According to his account, yes. But Smerdyakov's account of that same night is very different, far more deliberate.
What does Smerdyakov say happened?
He says he saw Fyodor Pavlovitch waiting for Grushenka. He used the secret signal knocks they'd agreed on for her arrival.
Tricked him.
Told Fyodor Pavlovitch that Grushenka had come, and when Fyodor Pavlovitch opened the door, peering through the crack, Smerdyakov killed him.
Chillingly calculated.
Very.
So after leaving the house, Dmitri flees to Mokro, this village.
Right, and starts spending money wildly with some disreputable Poles he meets there.
Spending money he didn't have, or...
Well, that becomes the question. Grushenka eventually arrives, but then the officer, her old seducer, shows up unexpectedly.
Oh.
Huge emotional upheaval. Dmitri is in a state of absolute frenzy and despair, trying desperately to raise money, even offering 3,000 rubles to the Poles.
Which is where he gets arrested.
Exactly. He's found with blood on his hands.
From Grigory, he claims.
During the interrogation, He vehemently denies killing or robbing his father, but he confesses he intended to murder someone for money that very day.
Not a great thing to admit.
Not at all. And the key piece of evidence against him is the discovery of 1,500 rubles sewn up in a little bag around his neck.
Where did that come from?
His explanation is complicated.
Yeah.
He says it was money stolen from Katerina, part of the 3,000 she gave him, but that it was rightfully his anyway, and he'd been keeping it hidden, sewn up like that for a month.
That sounds suspicious.
It definitely strains credibility for the investigators.
Yeah.
And for the reader, frankly.
So the trial becomes the formal stage for all this, the search for truth, or at least a verdict.
Yeah. The sources describe the atmosphere the town has stirred up. There's a bias against Dmitri, particularly among the men. Some of the ladies are apparently more sympathetic.
Interesting gender split.
Dmitri's plea is central. Guilty to drunkenness and dissipation. Not guilty of the death of that old man. Not guilty of robbing him.
A clear denial of the main charges.
Yes. Then we hear key testimonies. Grigory recounts seeing the door open and hearing Smerdyakov behind a screen just before he was attacked.
Placing Smerdyakov inside.
Potentially. Ratitin, the intellectual, gives testimony that reveals his own cynical nature and his relationship with Grushenka.
He calls Dmitri a murderer.
Briefly, yes, though his testimony gets somewhat discredited when Grushenka reveals he's actually her cousin, which he'd hidden.
Ah, bias. Okay, what about medical testimony?
It's conflicting. Dr. Herzenstube suggests Dmitri might suffer from aberration, implying the crime could have been almost involuntary, a sudden impulse.
Like temporary insanity.
Sort of. But Dr. Varvinsky questions Dmitri's behavior in court, like looking at the jury, instead of his lawyer debating whether it's a sign of abnormality or actually perfectly natural.
Trying to read his mind, basically.
Pretty much. Madame Holocaust's testimony is just confusing.
The gold mines lady.
The gold mines lady.
Yeah.
She rambles, denies Dmitri ever threatened his father in her presence, which contradicts other accounts. It's not very helpful.
And Katerina Ivanovna, her testimony must have been huge.
Hugely dramatic and impactful. She confesses giving Dmitri the 3,000 rubles. Then, the bombshell.
Yeah.
She reads aloud a letter from Dmitri where he explicitly talks about murdering his father.
Oh, wow. That letter.
Yeah, she has hysterics on the stand. Her testimony seems intended to portray her own generosity and maybe Dmitri's potential for remorse. She mentions him returning to check on Grigory, aiming to save him, maybe, but that letter delivers a devastating blow to his case.
So the prosecutor, Ippolit Kirillovich, he must have jumped on that.
Oh, absolutely. He presents this powerful argument for Dmitri's guilt. He gives this psychological analysis of the Karamazov nature.
What does that mean?
He argues it has these dual extremes capable of high ideals and base actions, making Dmitri, while maybe not a common thief, perfectly capable of this kind of fraud and violence.
Using psychology against him.
Definitely. He hangs his case heavily on that letter as proof of premeditation. He dismisses Dmitri's story about the hidden money as completely unbelievable.
What about Smerdyakov?
He suggests Smerdyakov could have been an accomplice, maybe even forced by Dmitri. His speech is very rhetorical, stirs the audience, even touches on the perceived moral condition of Russia at large.
Powerful stuff. What about the defense, Vychukovich?
Vychukovich, the defense lawyer, aims to dismantle the prosecution's case, piece by piece. He challenges the psychological interpretations. He argues Dmitri returning to Grigory was genuine remorse, not checking if a witness was dead. He argues the hidden money story does fit the two extremes of Dmitri's character, capable of both reckless spending and this kind of secretive hoarding.
Turning the psychology back around.
Exactly. And crucially, he directly points to Smerdyakov as the alternative, more likely, murderer.
Finally, someone says it clearly.
He also challenges the whole idea that Dmitri owed filial love to such an unworthy father like Fyodor. And he appeals to the jury's mercy, their sense of doubt. Reasonable doubt.
A classic defense strategy.
Yes. And in the midst of all this legal sparring, the sources mention Ivan's sudden, desperate outbursts in court.
What does he do?
He declares that Smerdyakov is the real murderer and demands he be brought in as a witness. It's the moment the truth he's been wrestling with just bursts out.
Too late, maybe. Or?
The sources don't detail the immediate impact, but it's a pivotal, frantic moment.
Okay. Now, moving away from the intense drama of the main plot, the sources also introduce this parallel thread. It explores the suffering of children.
Right, primarily through the story of Captain Snegiryov and his son, Alyosha.
And this whole tragic subplot, it stems from an earlier incident.
Where Dmitri publicly humiliated Captain Snegiryov, dragged him by his beard, made him kiss his hand. Just brutal humiliation.
Awful.
And this act of cruelty has devastating consequences. not just for the captain, but for his son Alyosha. He suffers relentless mockery from the schoolboys because of what happened to his father.
Kids can be cruel.
Terribly. His pain and defiance are shown so vividly when he throws stones at the other boys and even bites Alyosha's finger when Alyosha tries to approach him.
He's lashing out.
Understandably. Alyosha tries to intervene, visits Alyosha, attempts to help. He brings a gift of 20 rubles money he was given for himself.
A kind gesture.
But the captain, despite his poverty, despite crying, he returns it. It highlights their immense pride, the depth of their wounded honor. They can't accept charity, especially linked to the source of their shame. We also meet Kolya Krasotkin, one of the schoolboys. Initially seems quite arrogant, full of youthful idealism about heroism, die for all humanity, and intellectual pretensions.
A bit full of himself.
A bit. But he develops his connection with Alyosha. And in a really touching moment, he finds Zhuchka, Alyosha's lost dog.
Alyosha thought the dog was dead, right?
Yes, and had given a puppy instead. Kolya finds the real dog and brings him back as a surprise for the sick boy.
Oh, that's lovely.
It is. The story of Alyosha's illness. His focus first on the puppy, then the return of his beloved real dog. It adds this incredibly poignant layer of pathos to the larger narrative of suffering.
And the sources end this thread with the scene after Alyosha's death.
Yeah. The boys gather at his grave, and Alyosha speaks to them. His words are just. Powerful message about remembering Alyosha, being brave in the face of life's difficulties, not fearing life itself, and the importance of doing good.
A moment of fragile hope, maybe? Connection born from shared grief?
I think that's a good way to put it. Fragile hope.
So what does this all mean? We have taken this deep dive into these excerpts, revealing incredible depths, contradictions in human nature.
Yeah, from Fyodor's destructive sensuality and greed,
to Dmitri's passionate chaos, Ivan's intellectual torment over faith and suffering,
and Alyosha's search for spiritual connection through Father Zossima's teachings.
We see that fundamental clash between faith and doubt played out not just in Ivan, but right there in the monastery itself after Zossima's death.
That was a shock to the system for them.
We see the destructive power of unresolved family conflict and the complex, often painful interplay of love, money, pride, in the relationships between Dmitri, Grushenka, Katerina.
Yeah, those relationships are just cauldrons of emotion. The sources show characters wrestling with the immense weight of freedom, the call of responsibility, and the profound, often inexplicable meaning of suffering. Whether it's the philosophical suffering Ivan grapples with.
The kind you think about.
Right? Or the physical and emotional suffering of Alyosha, or the social suffering, the humiliation of Captain Snare, but it's on all levels.
So let's bring it back to that core idea from Father Zossima, that radical idea that each is responsible to all for all. And considering all these multiple perspectives on suffering and justice, we've seen even rejecting a harmony built on a child's tears, Dmitri pleading innocence, the defense pointing fingers at Smerdyakov.
All these different truths or claims to truth.
If we are indeed responsible for everyone and everything around us, what does that responsibility mean for how we judge the characters in this story?
That's a heavy question. How do you judge Dmitri? Or Ivan? Or even Fyodor, given that idea?
Exactly. And perhaps more uncomfortably, what might it mean for judging ourselves?